Hello, and welcome to the BYU Family History Library webinar series. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Anna Allred, and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box, and I can address your concerns. You are welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar will be on September 29th, a Family Search Q&A with Catherine Grant. If you'd like to access the previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from Suzanne Hoffman, who will be giving a presentation on Introduction to Forensic Genealogy. Suzanne Hoffman, or the genealogy maven, has been working as a professional forensic genealogist for the past 3 years. She is also a specialist in Eastern European research and immigration. She has done extensive research in early Illinois, New England, and Virginia families in the US and Poland and Lithuania ancestry to the mid-1700s abroad. A graduate of the Boston University Genealogical Research Certificate Program, ProGen, GenProof, Forensic Genealogy 1 and 2 from GRIP, and other institute courses, she is currently working on her portfolio to earn her credentials for both her CG and AG. And Suzanne, if you're ready, we'll turn the time over to you.
Thank you much, Anna. There we go. I think you can see my screen. All right. As Anna said, I'm Suzanne Hoffman, and I'm a professional forensic genealogist. We're going to spend the next 45 minutes giving you a brief overview of forensic genealogy. It's where the law and genealogy intersects, or, of course, where CSI meets roots. So let's get started. So the application of forensic genealogy is the genealogical knowledge, methods, and standards to legal problems and proceedings. And that quote comes from Michael Ramage, who is a JD and a certified genealogist. He's also the president of the Association for Professional Genealogy, Forensic Genealogy Special Interest Group. It's prudent to start with that basic definition, because without it, we're still wondering what does forensic genealogy really cover? We're an organization that is part of the Association for Professional Genealogists. There are other organizations that cover forensic genealogy, but we are the ones that are really keeping up to date and forward, and have monthly meetings that are enjoyed by a wide variety of genealogists today. If you're really looking for something that's a little bit more dramatic in genealogy, this is the place you want to be, because you can be in a court of law swearing testimony. You can be out working with detectives trying to solve a crime. So there's a broad aspect to what genealogy under forensic genealogy really is. So the areas that fall under forensic genealogy today are missing and unknown heirs, wills and probate, real estate and property rights, natural resources and mineral rights, abandoned and unclaimed property, military repatriation, dual citizenship, immigration and tribal membership, adoption and unknown parentage, and of course, investigative genetic genealogy. 2 years ago, some of these items were not even on this list. Many of them have been elevated in status to be administered in courts of law. Some, like wills and probate, always have been. The newest edition, investigative genetic genealogy, has a controversial standing and is under scrutiny from almost every single legal court, and each new day brings new challenges and successes. There's a lot of material here, so don't try to read the slides, just listen to what I'm saying. I'll mention all the elements of each slide's content as we go along. So, what are the major differences between forensic and traditional genealogists? A forensic genealogist can't afford to be wrong. There are very often consequences to a mistake or an error being left out. A court of law can request an affidavit and the presence in court in the different states. You need to know the laws of the different states to regulate that will be regulating forensic genealogists and investigative genetic genealogists. We delve too close to the privacy laws. So if you're looking at descendants versus ancestors, that's a big difference between forensic and traditional, where if you're looking for true genealogy, you're going to go back in time. You're looking for ancestors. We're coming forward in time because we're talking to people and we're trying to solve a challenge from today. You have to have a lot more sleuthing skills if you're a forensic genealogist. You have to be adept at being able to work with material that isn't cast in stone. It isn't on microfiche, microfilm, or in digitized records. It's somewhere in the internet, or it's something you put together from social media. So that sleuthing skill really comes in handy. Once you find that most recent common ancestor, you have to bring it forward. Some of the forensic work that we do, you can only go back so many generations. And when you come forward, you can only come forward so many generations. Again, it's all dictated by the law. Some states require additional private investigation licensing, and that is becoming increasingly more pronounced as we move into that investigative genetic genealogy area. Third tools also tend to be expensive, so you tend to have um, a, a stockpile of different tools that you use that you've had to buy, um, including insurance. Uh, if you're in the field where you have to appear in court, that you have the law behind you, or that there's a commitment that needs to be made, you need to be insured against liability. You could be found less than um, appropriate from a liability perspective with information that you share. And if you need to testify in a court of law, you've got to be covered. Formal incorporation is thereby also required. It's really a commitment that you're making and a benefit. And most importantly, you've got to be willing to talk to random people. This is not for the shy and faint of heart. This is something that it's a very important aspect to it. Forensic genealogists tend to spend more time focused on the living. They need to be comfortable speaking with people they don't know, articulating clearly what it is they're doing, how it might impact the person to whom they're speaking. And consequently, this is not a slide, but it's also the area of genealogy where you can charge a little bit more than most other areas. So this next area we're going to talk about is pertaining to property rights and inheritance. We're going through the list of the different types of areas within forensic genealogy. So talking about missing and unknown heirs, wills and probate, real estate and property rights, natural resources and mineral rights, and abandoned and unclaimed property. Of the 9 categories under forensic, these 5 all relate directly to property rights and inheritance. Most of these are related to inanimate objects and how they're governed under the law, with the exception of the first item, of course. So let's jump right into inheritance and ownership. They're at the heart of the property rights. State and local laws govern the distribution of property. If no will, being intestate, exists upon death, the lawyers must do the due diligence. The court and estate legal administrators hire forensic genealogists to research heirs. Contested wills could also require research. Divorces, premature deaths, misattributed parentage, special bequests, they may alter simple wills, and probate requiring additional research. And property has been passed down without the benefit of a will or probate and now needs historical review of an owner long deceased. Again, something that a forensic genealogist would take part in. Most of these points relate to the living and recently deceased, the relationship of a person to their property and its eventual disbursement. Each court of law may handle property differently, While it is more critical that the probate attorney understands the nuances of the local law, it's also prudent for the forensic genealogist to understand exactly what they should be researching in terms of the relations and the generations of those relations. So, where we have an adage that says possession is 9/10 of the law, I'm going to say it's not 9/10 of the law. The law usually has evolved and must be reviewed at each relevant time frame for passage of property for every state. So that means if I'm looking at a state from 1890, I need to know the laws in that state covering the time frame in which I'm looking, and if the property has passed through to other heirs over the time, I need to be able to know that the laws have changed and what law is applicable for what is actually happening over time. Land, dwellings, real developed property, unimproved property, mineral rights, all have laws and inheritance claims that have evolved and matured over time. Boundaries may have been redrawn, landmarks may have shifted, parcels may have been divided up unevenly. This all must be reviewed. And deeds, quitclaims, quiet titles, adverse possession, and foreclosure are all elements of the law that convey property from one party to the next. A property may have been lovingly cared for by a family member and shared for all generations. Think of a family house in the mountains that people have all gone to. But there's a deed that determines ownership at some point, and all wills and claimants have equal voice until it's resolved in a court of law. While possession is not 9/10 of the law, legal paperwork is 9/10 of the law. So natural resources and mineral rights is a real hot area for forensic genealogy. Think of what has been in the paper these past few um, weeks about water rights or oil rights and moving oil across other people's land, or being able to understand, who can start fracking and who can't. So natural resource and mineral rights is a segment that it's better known in certain states. I'm in Chicago. There's nothing here in Chicago. I grew up in the East Coast. There's very little in the East Coast other than logging. But think of Texas, think of Colorado, think of California. They all are intrinsically involved in mineral rights and natural resources on a day-to-day basis. And local law impacts how these resources are distributed. Mineral rights can be separated and passed to heirs separately from property. Oil, gas, water, coal, minerals, stone, peat, and other substances can all be separated from the land in which they are found. Separation from the land may be due to financial reasons, business arrangements, thievery, asset distribution, or debt repayment. So other states have basic laws, but the laws in the separation of the physical land and the embedded and then released minerals have the state and local laws that govern all the different facets of the transactions that may occur. A farmer may need help paying for future crops, and he sells the right to a developer to take the mineral assets from the estate, thereby keeping the land and getting rid of the headache of removing whatever substance he has. He may not sell it outright, he may lease it, and he may take a share of the profits. There's all kinds of business arrangements that can be made. In the mid 1900s, there were speculators in the mid 1800s, there were speculators selling land rights to land they didn't own. It said complete with deeds that had to be unraveled. If a landowner didn't have enough land to distribute to all his children, he might divide up the land rights. It would ensure that all the children benefited from the land. Or if the landowner had a debt to pay, he could contract to pay with his as yet unforeseen assets beneath the soil until the debt was paid. The problem didn't necessarily occur in the then current generation. And it's really interesting that you have that ability to separate the land from what's in the land. And basically, most people know what personal property is. It's something you own. By definition, it's something you can take with you. In other words, not nailed down. By contrast, with real property, as in real estate, uh, it's nailed down. It's a physical asset. So the law has two distinct definitions, and therefore there are two legal frameworks for natural resources and mineral rights. If the mineral is still in the ground and hasn't been improved or removed, it's real property and it falls under that legal jurisdiction. If the mineral has been leached or taken from the land, it's personal property and it falls under that legal domain. So mineral interests can pass with the land without issue. They could be identified and deeded separately from the land. Think of what would happen if someone, say in the 1930s in the Dust Bowl, they wanted to hold on to their land, but they separated the land from what could be drawn out of the land. They had speculators on the land. There were people selling processes to extract goods, oil, water, all kinds of different uh, gases from the land itself. And this was the challenge that people were faced with. They may have forgot over time, or say that person died intestate and the will with the land passed on to an heir. So this brings up the issue, who actually owns those rights? And you have to go back and do a tremendous amount of research to ensure that you have the exact property rights, as they may be distinct from the land, or they may be divided up amongst various heirs. The property rights distribution may have had a time limit on the mineral and land, and they may be deeded separately. They could have different ownership patterns. What happens if a corporation bought the mineral rights and then something happened to that corporation? So the forensic genealogist in mineral-rich states has a real and personal interest in tracing ownership and hereditary transfers. And this keeps a lot of people busy. Abandoned and unclaimed property can refer to both real and personal property, but it is to real estate that we usually refer. This is traditionally a pure air search undertaking. Unclaimed property we can discover through online sources. I know I found resources that my parents had overlooked, that popped up in a newspaper. And I had to go through a series of challenges with coming up with the paperwork that they needed to actually, so that I could get the property, since they had both died earlier in the decade. But usually real estate is initiated from a title company doing a title search, or a probate attorney looking to validate a will or asset passing. So you've got the newspapers for the unclaimed property. You've got intestate estates where you might have unclaimed property. You have people with wills where they have property but they don't mention it. And somebody has to go back and find out about ownership there. It might be abandoned. This is where you get to talk about adverse possession, which is more commonly known as squatters' rights. Who has the possession of the land. It's not difficult to trace at all times. The tax rolls come in very handy. But everything I've mentioned has a legal side to it. And that's really what people are focusing on, is the legal aspect of it, which is why it falls under, again, forensic genealogy. So let's now look at the next group, ethics, rights, and inheritance, as I call them. This is military repatriation, dual citizenship, immigration and naturalization, and tribal membership. And they don't all seem to go together, but in effect they do, in terms of the law and how the law relates to the action in these rights. And they're mostly personal in nature. Military repatriation is actually a wonderful selfless area that the military has followed through on. The Military Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, which is DPAA for short, is identifying and locating the remains of service members and matching them to the closest living family members. They work primarily on World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. The Army, Navy, and Marine Corps use certified forensic genealogists to find the needed relatives. They have very prescribed ways that they do this research. They use DNA and they used the two closest relatives to help identify the remains that are brought forward. And the genealogists work as teams in a very time-constrained, contracted work environment to assist the military in the program of No One Left Behind. It's a closed community. There are only a very few firms that have contracts with the federal government to do this, but they do hire genealogists to work for them. And to have a contract directly with the government, you must be credentialed. But this is an organization or a type of forensic genealogy in which a lot of people from our organization have participated in. Dual citizenship, a home away from home. It has its benefits. We'd all like to be able to flit here and there and have domiciles in multiple countries. It's also not so easy to obtain. And most citizens or most people who are after dual citizenship are really after getting a place in the EU. If you can be in the European Union, you've got more flexibility from having to supply visas for cross-country travel and things like that. Land ownership is also often a draw. There are countries where, unless you're a citizen of the country, you can't own land. But there are severe tax implications. And it involves careful attention to the application and the country requirements. Many sought-after countries change their requirements and their restrictions on a regular basis. The forms are generally in the other language. They require documentation from the destination country, and you must meet certain ancestral needs with regards to the citizenship. In the case of dual citizenship, the country to whom you're applying generally will have pretty strict guidelines and may require language skills in the native language. Some countries do not even allow dual citizenship. Others require proof of residency or passports of previous citizens, such as your parents or grandparents. It's a bit difficult for Eastern Europeans whose boundaries change or dissolve intermittently. There are companies and genealogists who specialize in dual citizenship applications. They commonly get requests from Italy, Ireland, Spain. Refugee families are the most easy to repatriate if passports or immigration documents still exist. Some countries will go back only one generation, others back two or three. Rarely will citizenship be granted if there's more than 100 years from the date of departure. Borders have changed significantly, we all know, in the past 50 years, around the turn of the 20th century especially. And EU citizenship is kind of difficult if you don't have a job or prospective employment. They don't want someone coming over. And we used to have the likely public charge that someone would be LPC on the immigration if they didn't know what they were going to do for a living. Well, the foreign countries that we could apply for dual citizenship also don't want a likely public charge. You have to be able to prove that you have an adequate income or will have an adequate income to sustain your being able to live in their organization. And just like in the US, land ownership originally required naturalization in some of the countries. So property restitution is a motivator to those who had family property taken as in World War II, the Nazis swept through Europe. That's not an easy task. I know many people who've tried to do it in Poland and they've been unsuccessful. There are, as I've said, entire firms dedicated to helping people do dual citizenship. And it's often through a bureaucratic tangle that is highly legal in context, and all the documents must be notarized that you're going to be using. So again, this is another area of forensic genealogy. Just as an aside, paying taxes under dual nationalities usually requires the hiring of an international tax consultant. So that's expensive in of itself. So I already mentioned a little bit about immigration and naturalization. This is sort of an odd group to be under forensic because there really isn't a forensic nature other than the fact immigration and naturalization is all under the USCIS, and the United States Citizen and Immigration Services really is the successor to the Immigration and Naturalization Services, and is governed by the um, our friends at the um, our friends at the airport, as I like to call them. So you've got the same group of people who are trying to identify legal status that you have within the United States, and you want the records. The records belong to you. The immigration and naturalization records, for the most part, we're looking for people who, if you're doing genealogy, you can go all the way back to, 1820 with looking for the custom lists all the way through to today with the ship manifests that you would want. And a lot of times you wind up having to file a Freedom of Information Act request to get these records. They're in the National Archives, but they're not necessarily in Archive 1 and 2, which are Washington, D.C. and College Park, Maryland. They may be in St. Louis. They may be out on the West Coast in California. So there's 3 stages to the naturalization forms. There's the declaration of intent, there's a petition, and there's the actual naturalization certificate. And each of those stages can be performed anywhere that someone either landed or they chose to live. And the records may be strewn widely across the country. In fact, there are thousands of feet of material in boxes, some indexed, some not, sitting in warehouses that even the people who work for USCIS don't know exist, or they're not as familiar with those records. The genealogy program that was created by Marion Smith some 30 years ago to enable genealogists to have access to all of these records um, are it's a very expensive program. Your first request is going to cost you $65, and that's only to see if those records can even be accessed, and then another $65 once you've got the appropriate numbers to request the file um, to get it. So your sunk cost is already $130. But you don't know if you can get them because you don't know if they fall under which act, which communication file, which registry, and you've got all of the different federal record groups that these all fell into. So it falls under the forensic genealogist because you're probably going to want to have somebody involved from the legal standpoint of whether you're filing a Freedom of Information Act or you're better understanding how the files are structured within the immigration and naturalization record keeping. So, I mean, they divided the records into 3 large time frames: early time frame of the 18th and 19th century, then what they call the Great Wave, which is the last part of the 19th century to the early 20th century, and then more recent, which is the later 20th century and 21st. You've got custom lists, as we've already mentioned. Then you have immigration lists, but the immigration lists can have border arrival manifests. They can also have immigration control records. They can have the visa files, the registry files, the alien registers, and then alien files. You've got all the court naturalization files, which are completely separate from the immigration records. You naturalize after you've supplied all the immigration documentation. And some people didn't go through all the different levels. So you have to be wary of where it stops and where it begins again. There's huge correspondence files. And that, as they're finding, there are non immigration records that are also commingled with the immigration records. So you may get records that may be redacted, means things may be whited out that you absolutely were looking for, like parents' names or maiden names of people. So you get into this tug of war with what information they'll give you and what they won't, which again is why the FOIA request is so important when dealing with the naturalization records. How about a desire to belong? So I sort of I group these together in terms of the immigration naturalization, uh, the dual citizenship, and tribal affiliation. So all 3 of these groups have a very prescribed application process and record request process. Lineage groups such as the Sons of American Revolution or the Daughters of American Revolution have large databases of eligible members, but you must prove your own relationship to the patriot. The Colonial Dames, Daughters of the Utah Pioneers, Children of the Confederacy, Daughters of the Republic of Texas, the Mayflower Society, etc., all have the same rigorous applications. In fact, there are about 68 different societies listed in Wikipedia under Lineage that restrict membership to those who can prove that they have members. Now, Lineage Societies may not have federal guidelines, but they're governed by the documents, and some are held by governmental agencies, which you need to prove your inclusion in that society. Plus the fact there are most of the lineage societies have their own lineage members who are genealogists who will help you get through the quagmire to be able to be certified uh, or to be accepted into the group. The Department of Indian Affairs claims they don't have anything to do with tribal membership. I found that an interesting um, turn of events, because tribal membership is dictated from the Dawes Rolls, which covers the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Creek, Seminole, and Chickasaw Indians from the Dawes Rolls that were implemented in 1899 to 1907. That only enabled tribal members who had lineal descent from someone's named who was named on the tribe's base roll. Hence the Dawes rolls being so fundamental in being able to be added to tribal membership. People are always thrilled when they look at their ethnicity estimates to see if they actually have American Indian in their DNA. Well, that doesn't prove that you're an American Indian, and you've got to go back and find your family on the Dawes rolls to really be accepted into the program. And the program it's a federal program that allows for certain how to put it, certain federal aid or federal programs that are specific to those that were living on Indian reservations earlier and have continued. The Indians didn't have a choice initially whether to join or not join the Dawes Rolls. They were put on the Dawes Rolls if they were one of those 5 tribes. Today there are 574 recognized American tribes, and they were added based on ethnicity. And there are still tribes today. A funny story is my daughter, who has an eensy weensy teensy bit of American Indian, is part of the Nanticoke, Lenni, and the Lenape tribe in New Jersey, who are state recognized but not federally recognized. So they're not even on the Dawes rolls, which I thought was amusing. Applicable laws are under development. This is the final piece of what I'm going to discuss today, and this is probably the most controversial. As we look at adoption and unknown parentage and investigative genetic genealogy, this is the area that everyone's noticing. It's exciting, it's current, you often have a sense of accomplishment when you find what you're looking for, and elation. DNA opens the doors, but it can also be extremely threatening to family relationships. Adoptions cannot easily be resolved without the addition of DNA if there's no paper trail. Unknown parentage has both highs and lows for families. For some, it's a painful reminder. For others, they just want to know their family. And this is where search angels come into play. But it's not something that's something that ordinary genealogists should undertake. A lot of the people who are working in adoption and unknown parentage have social work skills, they have mentoring skills. You don't know what strife has occurred in the family to cause an abandonment or a relinquishment of a child. And there, as I said, there are networks of people who do this for a living. They've created a vast set of underwritten or unwritten rules for approaching and speaking with families in which these occur. A statistic I've heard is that 10% of the population is affected by misattributed parentage or a non-parental event. I've found two, even in my own, cousins. One was a regular paper trail that we happened across, and the other was uncovered in a Y DNA test. And they're very painful if someone is not familiar with what's going on. The adoptee generally wants to know what's happening, but if they don't know the history, it's not something that's necessarily comfortable for both sides of the investigation. Investigative genetic genealogy is a whole nother can of worms. It's where all the controversy lies relative to DNA. Barbara Ray Venter, who solved the Golden State Killer case, and C.C. Moore and her show, The Genetic Detective, where she solved over 50 cold case crimes during, I think it was 2018, 2019. And she works for Parabon Nanolabs. And then Colleen Fitzpatrick, way back in 2013, was one of the original genealogists in the forefront of forensic genealogy and helped develop and identify this is a branch of genealogy. This is where the law becomes increasingly difficult to feel comfortable with what genealogists are doing. The forensic genealogists, because they're tied into the law, can work through the challenge, especially with law enforcement, especially with the laws governing what you can do that doesn't encroach upon private investigation laws, and also the court system, where in some cases they are not willing to accept DNA as primary evidence. Whenever anybody undertakes any kind of investigation with genetic genealogy is not the end all and be all. It cannot stand on its own. It must be documented with traditional genealogical research methods to form the basis of a case and the basis of the actual closure of an investigation. So Colleen had the foresight to say that the industry was waiting for the technology to catch up, and that is very true. Unfortunately, now it has. So the next thing on the list of challenges is the controversy of in vitro fertilization that has hundreds, if not thousands, of IVF babies now finding out that their father is not who they thought they were told. Sperm donors in the 1960s and 70s who were promised anonymity are now learning just how many children that they sired. No one foresaw the idea of DNA becoming a consumer pastime and results being as public as they have become. So for interesting reading on that front, I would take a look at the book Inheritance by Danny Shapiro, which walks one through a in vitro fertilization case that has startling consequences. But within forensic genealogy, as we've gone through all the 9 components of it, it's important to recognize that there is serious interaction with the law. You are putting yourself on the line, and it's so much of your training and your ability to communicate is important in any conversation or written document that you supply a court of law. You are liable for mistakes in most instances, and you must be cognizant of the fact that you have to do exhaustive search, and usually within a very short time frame. So with that, I will open it up for questions. Anna, if you want to handle that for me.
Thank you so much. Do we so the questions we have one in the there's a couple in the Q&A. So someone asked, is there a handout for this presentation?
We talked about that. I can get one to you. I can put it up there.
Okay, yeah, and then I can just put it on the website and like a link to it with on
Sure.
the YouTube page.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And then someone asked, wondering if there is a process or possibility of exhuming a great grandparent for DNA evidence.
They are starting to consider that. You know, the first program that they sort of put in place was being able to look at stamps or hairbrushes, so the hair follicle or saliva that was on stamps, things like that. Um, they've not gone into the practice. I think it's extraordinarily expensive to exhume anything. In fact, there was one episode in CC Moore's 9-show series where they did exhume a body for forensic reasons, and it was very interesting, very messy, smelly, and practice that you really don't want to do. So no, it's not a common practice, but I suppose if you're willing to pay for it, there are some organizations that'll do it, but typically not just for random DNA genealogy work.
Awesome, thank you. Margaret asked, what is the fastest turnaround you have had to do for a case?
Probably 3 weeks is the fastest turnaround that I've had to do, which is creating the report and also um, having the evidence necessary. And that was difficult because I had to get the actual documents. I cannot use indices or reproductions off of a microfilm. I actually had to have the actual dockets from the court or from the county.
Cool. And then we have someone else asked, who owns the right to fossils, small or large, such as dinosaurs, the landowner, or who has the mineral rights to the land?
Well, it depends on who digs them up too, right? So if it's on someone's personal property, it's on their real estate, and it's in their land. If it's a fossil and it's an archaeological dig, that's usually worked out before the dig happens. If you just happen to find a fossil by local digging, it's yours. No one's going to come after you for it. But if you find a whole dinosaur, chances are you're going to find one bone first, and then you're going to call the local university to see if they can start an archaeological dig to do the rest of it.
Super cool. Well, thank you, Suzanne. That was a wonderful presentation, and thanks for doing that Q&A with us. Thank you all for joining us today. We hope you will join us for our next webinar, which will be on September 29th, the Family Search Q&A with Catherine Grant. A recording of this webinar will be made available next week, and you can view that on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fhl_webinars@byu.edu or follow Facebook and Twitter. Thank you and have a wonderful week.
Thank you.